Hello and welcome to topic 12, lecture 1. And in this lecture, we're going to be learning about the correctional population. So what are we going to be covering in this lecture? First, we're going to take a look at the U.S. inmate population. We're going to learn about how many people are currently incarcerated in the United States and who is actually incarcerated, taking a look at the demographics of the U.S. inmate population. We're also going to look at how this population has changed over time, both in terms of its size and in terms of its demographic makeup. We're also going to, talk about the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic had on the size of the inmate population. Following or during the COVID-19 pandemic, the number of people incarcerated in the United States reduced greatly. And so we're going to talk about why that is, and we're going to then ask, do we think that this decrease in incarceration will continue? Was it just because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll go back to the, will that population increase? We're also going to be talking about should the number of people that are incarcerated in the United States be decreased. So that's what we've got on the docket, so let's go ahead and get started. So we're all familiar with the quote that the United States makes up 5% of the world population, but is home to 20% of the world's inmate population. That's the way the documentary that we watched, The 13th, begins with that quote, and the level of incarceration in the United States is a focal point of the book Locked In. Today, as I mentioned, that the inmate population number has actually decreased. So today, it's more accurate to say that we make up 4% of the world population and 16% of the world of the world inmates. Okay, but no matter how you slice it, the United States has one of the highest rates of incarceration in the world, and we are home to the largest inmate population. We have the largest body of people incarcerated compared to any other country. So we're pretty familiar with that, but what we might be less familiar with is who's actually incarcerated in the United States. What is the makeup of the prison population, and how has that changed over time? So in the next few slides, we're going to take a look at the more details about the inmate population. They come from the Prison Policy Initiative website. It's a very useful website to take a look at, particularly if you're interested in the issue of reducing mass incarceration in the United States. It's really important to know who is incarcerated, what they're incarcerated for, in order to understand the policy impacts that will come with possibilities of reforming and reducing incarceration in the United States. So let's look at the U.S. inmate population. So this graph shows you how many people are locked up in the United States. And so as of 2023, 1.9 million people are incarcerated in the United States. Another way of looking at that is that of 100,000 people that live in the United States, 565 of them are in some form of incarceration. Okay, that's an incredibly high rate of incarceration, although that rate has gone down recently. Okay, but it's still one of the highest in the United States. Now let's break down this pie chart and sort of look at it. We'll put on a magic pen here if I can figure out how to do it. Okay, and so as we know, the vast majority of people incarcerated in the United States are incarcerated either in state prisons or in local jails. Okay, the federal population, which includes both federal prisons and federal jails, that is a relatively small number. Okay, and I'll let you go in to take a look at these other parts of it, but this main part is of the pie is what I want us to concentrate on, because that really shows the vast majority of people who are incarcerated. So those who are in state prisons, and we know this from Locked In, that nearly half of them are there because of violent offenses. Okay, so it's that piece of the pie chart. Okay, and then you have property offenses, drug offenses, and public order offenses. Okay, but the vast majority of people in state prisons are there because of violent offenses. That in local jails, okay, we see that it's a significant number of people. Nearly a quarter of the overall population is in jail, and of those, the vast majority of those people are not convicted. Okay, they're waiting in jail because they cannot make bail. Okay. And so then this pie chart piece here, that shows you those who have been sentenced to a term of less than a year. Okay. And so this gives you a sense of basically how many people are locked up in the United States. So this graph basically shows you the global distribution of incarcerated populations at the start of the pandemic. I looked for more recent data, and I just don't think this comparison data is out yet. Okay, so it's a little outdated, but not by much. And the comparison is still fairly accurate. Okay. And so here's the United States with their high rate of incarceration. And this is just the sheer number of people that are incarcerated. Again, it's pre-pandemic levels. So you can see it used to be 2.2 million people were incarcerated. It's gone down to 1.9, okay, but still high. And then you see China, and here, let me put on my magic pen, got China here, Brazil, Russia, okay, and then other countries, okay. And so, the second in terms of the amount of people incarcerated is China. But it's kind of, I'll go out on a limb and say it's kind of embarrassing that, we incarcerate more people than, two of the major authoritarian regimes within the world. When you look and I'm sure you know this, but when you compare the United States rates of incarceration to the rates of incarceration in countries like us, like members of NATO, European countries, our rate of incarceration is double, if not more, than other countries that are like us. So when it comes to the rate of incarceration, there's a couple things I want you to keep in mind. One major thing is that the national rate masks regional differences, okay? And so when we say that the United States incarceration rate is 565 for every 100,000 people that live in the United States, keep in mind that that's the national average, but that some states have much higher rates of incarceration and other states have much lower rates of incarceration. And so that southern states have much higher rates of incarceration, some of which are like almost 1.5 times the national rate, okay? And so Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, Oklahoma, Alabama, they all have really high rates of incarceration, okay? On the flip side, that some states have much lower rates of incarceration. A lot of the northeastern states, such as Maine, Vermont, Rhode Island, and even New Jersey, they're relatively low, not just relatively. I mean, Massachusetts' rate of incarceration is half of the national rate, okay? But they have much lower rates of incarceration. And so keep that in mind when you're thinking about the overall national rate. Some states have much higher levels of incarceration. Now, keep in mind what we learned about earlier in the semester, right? There might be some reasons for that. We know that there's less crime in the Northeast than there is in the South and the Southwest, okay? And so that might play a role. Race might play a role as well. Those are, a lot of those are former Confederate states that have high levels of incarceration, and we know that there is a link between race and injustice and treatment by the police and the criminal justice system in general. So keep that in mind. So where's Wisconsin? Where do we fit into this? Well, Wisconsin, when you look at Wisconsin as a whole, we have about the same rate of incarceration as the nation. However, when we look at particular populations in Wisconsin, it's a lot different. Earlier this semester, when we listened to the podcast, you learned that Wisconsin has the highest rate of incarceration for Black men. It's the highest rate in the nation. And so Black people comprise 42% of the incarcerated individuals in the United States, even though Black people only make up 6% of the population based on the 2020 census, okay? And so that, the rate of incarceration, particularly for Black men, is the highest in the country, which is something, well, we should probably think about, and probably not surprising given the long legacy of racism and segregation within Wisconsin. So while Wisconsin has the highest rate of incarceration for Black men in the United States, that while they might have the highest level of incarceration rate of Black men, that overall in the United States, the prison population is that African Americans are overrepresented within the prison population in the United States. Okay. So over here, this is like the general population in the United States. Okay. And so 40% of the general population is white, 18% is Latino, 13% is Black, and then less than 1% is Native American. Okay. And so then on this side here, this is the incarcerated population. And so that while 13% of the US population is Black, 38% of the prison population is Black, and 60% of the population is white, makes up 38% of the prison population. The others are pretty commensurate, not, 18 to 21, a little bit of an overrepresentation, 2% to 1, again, an overrepresentation that shouldn't be minimized. But the biggest gap that we see is the gap in terms of overrepresentation of Black folks who are incarcerated, and an underrepresentation of white folks who are incarcerated. Don't want to draw any conclusions, or there's as you go on to be juniors and seniors, and you're taking your criminology classes, there's a lot to unpack here in terms of what are the causes of these gaps and how to close those gaps. But this is just kind of giving you the basic facts that you need to understand the makeup of the demographics of the prison population. So the chapter that we're doing here at the end of the semester focuses on corrections, right? Prison, imprisonment, either in prison or jail. The chapter before that has to do with other forms of correctional treatment, in particular probation and parole. And so I encourage you to read those chapters if you want. They're important, but I think it's important to keep in mind, as it says there, that incarceration is just one piece of a much larger system of correctional control, okay? That when you think about the entire U.S. justice system, that 5.5 million people have some their lives are in some way controlled by the criminal justice system. And so you see here that 2.9 million people are under probation, 750,000 are on parole, and then here a little bit more than a quarter are within correctional facilities. Okay, and so keep that in mind as if you are in the camp that is sort of wanting to decrease incarceration in the United States, chances are that means that these other pieces of the pie are going to get bigger. And that's probably a good thing in terms of just sort of the collateral consequences and costs of incarceration and the cost that it has on families and communities. But that means that there's going to be funding that's not going to be needing to be in place in order to, balance, sort of the lives of individuals against, the mandate that the state has to make sure that we live in a safe country. So just something to keep in mind. All right, so I would be remiss if I didn't focus on gender a little bit in terms of understanding the U.S. prison population or incarcerated population. I would be remiss because I also teach a class in sex, gender, and public policy, and so feel free to take it. I'm teaching it in the fall semester. It's a great class, but it's important to sort of focus on this particular population because while we've seen a decrease in general incarceration in the United States, a lot of that decrease is coming because of a reduction of the number of men who are in prison. We're actually seeing higher rates of incarceration of women in the United States. Okay, but let's keep it in perspective. That women make up about 10% of the overall incarcerated population in the United States. Okay, and that kind of brings us back to the brain on trial earlier in the semester when we were talking about, are there some things that are sort of out of our control, right? Maybe it's chromosomal, right? And they sort of use the example of that, 90+% of people incarcerated have, and it's particular set of chromosomes, the XY set of chromosomes, okay? And so, there's a lot of reasons for why there is less women in prison than men. Some of it's biological, a lot of it's sociological, okay? But the reality is women make up 10% of the incarcerated population. Another thing I want you to keep in mind here is that that many more women are in local county jails than men are. Okay, so when women are incarcerated, they're likely to end up in what really is the most, as you're going to learn in your textbook this week, one of the most disorganized and dangerous, places. The local jails, underfunded, understaffed, dangerous for, health reasons and just for personal safety reasons as well. So a lot of women end up in local jails. Another thing I want you to keep in mind is that women, when they are in state prison, that they are, less likely to be in state prisons because of violent offenses. Okay. It still makes up about half of the prisoners, but the other half are other types of crimes. We have more men who are incarcerated because of violent endeavors. Okay. And then also, since so many women are in local jails, you'll also see that nearly 2/3 of those women are there, but they haven't been convicted yet. They're waiting in pending trial. And so, we think about the collateral consequences of incarceration. Women being incarcerated have significant collateral consequences, in particular because women are oftentimes caretaker of children. Children are involved. Women are much more likely to be head of households in single families, much more likely to be in poverty. And so, the fact that if you are incarcerated pending trial, that you don't have the bill to make the money, and the reverberating effects that's going to have on your family and your children in particular. So just some of the things to keep in mind as you're moving forward in your studies in criminal justice. All right, so this graph basically shows you that over time since the 1980s, that while we've seen it, so let me put on the magic pen here. The yellow is the men line, okay? And this is the rate of incarceration, the increase in the population of prisoners, that you have an increase in, but kind of a plateauing of men, which I had mentioned before. But, where we see a real increase is the number of women who are in prison populations, and that is increasing, okay? And this also might be a reflection, we don't know why, right? But there are some hypotheses that kind of drive this, okay? That as, are thinking about gender norms and what it means to be a woman are changing. That might play itself out in some of the activities that women might get involved in terms of criminal activities. It might just also have to do with changing attitudes within law enforcement. That there's this sort of chivalry hypothesis that women are less likely to be contacted by cops because of gender sort of social norms. But now might seem like, hey, let's have some gender equality. That we should treat women in the same fairness that we treat men. And so, we don't know why, but this is something to keep in mind in terms of reforming prison populations. If we're going to decline and reduce prison populations, we're really going to have to think about why this has increased and what we can do to decrease it.